Alright everyone, it's time for the Occult video 237 on the Yeti, the abominable snowman. This is both about the cryptid itself, my thoughts about it in general, I got the idea the other day, but it's also about a concept within the occult. And that concept is this, and you can see this throughout time. Remoteness causes folk tales. An area that's easily accessible has a tendency to generate different kinds of urban legends. They can be more flippant or cautionary in nature. The idea of legendary creatures in the more classical sense relies upon an area being remote. That's why the Mongolian death worm is still a tale, and tales of hoop snakes, living in Appalachia or something really aren't, because of the remoteness. Once an area has been explored, all of the ghouls and goblins have been dispelled, things are either rationalized or in some cases, they retreat beyond the edge of society. For instance, if you look at the era of modern exploration, when flight certainly and modern technology opens up the more remote parts of Africa and Asia for exploration by Western groups, which really isn't until, within the last 100 years or so, people start looking to the skies. All of a sudden, you get UFO encounters prioritized over cryptids. With the Yeti, what you've got is a tale from the Himalayan mountains. And I think it's technically pronounced Himalaya, but the Himalayas or whatever. The abominable snowman is a cryptid that's basically like Bigfoot. The tales appear to be older, potentially within the lore of the area. And what happened is that people that were exploring that fairly remote region at the time took the folklore and rationalized and naturalized it and assumed that they're dealing with some sort of actual physical entity. It's interesting, if you read Lake Monster Traditions by Claude Gagnon and Michel Murger, the second edition, I believe that is, if you read that, then they make the case, in short, that the cryptozoologist, the skeptic, or rationalist, you could say, and the occultist are making the same claim about these creatures when they attempt to explain them. The explanation can be rational or cryptozoological or transcendental, but they're explaining a phenomena. That is, that they take it as a token that there is something to be actually explained, rather than simply denying that there's something there. So with Loch Ness, the occultist might say, well, it's some lake spirit. The rationalist, the skeptic, would say, well, it's basically you're seeing fish, you're seeing a floating log. The cryptozoologist says maybe it's a form of whale that's been landlocked there for the last 100 million years, and it's evolved to a freshwater climate, and you're seeing that. But they're all saying that there's a phenomenon to actually be spoken of. I think with the Yeti, what you're seeing is essentially, roughly a century ago, people begin penetrating these mountainous areas of Asia. They took the folklore, sort of ran with it. Anytime they were offered any curio by a local person, this is a Yeti skull cap, this is a Yeti skin, this is fur. Each time that happened, they would sort of take it for granted that it was real, and using the science available to them then in a remote area, of course, it was more difficult to tell, no, it's actually just bear fur. No, it's actually just a piece of bone from some human or some other recognizable species. That's sort of what happened. I'm not a huge believer in the abominable snowman because I can't see rationally, and this is the rationalist, the skeptic in me, I can't see how a large hominid, which is what it's described as being, or anything similar to that, whether hairy and intelligent or not, would be able to exist in such a remote location, actually manage to feed itself, keep up a reproducing population, so to speak, biologically, without being frequently detected. Some people say, well, they dwell in like caves and stuff. They're like cave people, essentially. That's further rationalization of the phenomenon that we haven't even proved exists. That is, we don't know that there's a phenomenon there. We're dealing with folklore and some grainy pictures, and that's really what you've got. This is slightly different from claims of Bigfoot, especially within the region, the Cascadian region normally associated with it. You've got a different climate. You've got a different, at this point, even level of remoteness. You have claims that are a little bit less fantastical in that you have a temperate sort of coniferous region that could sustain that kind of life. you have a little bit more anecdotal evidence for it. That being said, the idea of some ape-like or hominid species there is also something I would have to be generally skeptical of. We've got a little bit more to go on than some far-off icy mountain range, some glacier somewhere having a population of ape people on it. You certainly have maybe a little bit more reasoning behind the story. But that's still not that much to go on. In both cases, you have the remoteness as well. If you look at that region of the northwestern U.S., parts of British Columbia, it's extremely remote. That's why those stories persist, whereas you've had, if you look in the last 100 years, you've had sightings of Bigfoot or that sort of creature in areas that are now much more settled. Those sightings don't persist. They persist as an urban legend. And so you don't have new sightings, you have tales of a sighting that happened 50, 60 years ago. Well, my granddad remembers when Bigfoot used to be around here, and it must be dead by now, but there were Bigfoots around here in central Iowa. It's interesting that those stories happen. By the way, that's why we have quite a bit of active cryptozoology even in New England, because still, some parts of New England are very mountainous, they're not really settled, and there's not a whole lot going on there. You've got the Green Mountain National Forest, you've got probably half a dozen different recognizable local cryptid stories in and around the region of central Vermont. You've got more in Maine, certainly in New Hampshire. That's a tradition that has held more of that cryptozoological basis than areas that became more urban. Like the idea of, some Dutch explorer 400 years ago in what's now Manhattan talking about the weird creatures then. Well, those creatures didn't persist in Manhattan. But you're still going to have urban legends about alligators in the sewers, which may have been semi-true at least at a time. Ghosts and weird things like the elevator that goes to hell and stuff like that. Aliens, certainly. I think over time, if I had to say, because the Earth is becoming more and more less and less remote, people are more and more keyed into one another's cultures, you've got the internet, you've got more and more population in more and more places, more settlements, the forests falling to the axe, so to speak. Eventually, we're going to exhaust our own worldly cryptid supply, and people will be talking about space more. And the deep sea. It's arguably harder to penetrate and explore the deep oceans than it is at least near space. It's probably easier to send a probe up into orbit or to Mercury or something than it is to explore in the Marianas Trench. So I would expect nautical tales to make a comeback over maybe the next half century or so. It's going to be interesting because for the first time as well, and this is maybe not exactly the same topic, but it bears mentioning, I think we might see a globalist sort of cryptid tradition at some point, where the internet is facilitating strange tales about things that are being seen in the oceans or in space, and they really get intermixed culturally. It's going to be quite interesting, I think, to see. So, jury's technically out on the abominable snowman until you send up 1,000 expeditions to comb the whole range. My general feeling, though, is that it makes no sense, other than the remoteness aspect, it makes no sense that there would be this particular species in these mountains. It wouldn't make sense that they wouldn't move into a more temperate area where there's more food available, more shelter available. It literally doesn't make any form of sense whatsoever. Except if you say, well, modernity advanced and forced them up into the mountains. Well, again, that doesn't make any sense because we're talking about these remote tribes living up in basically the subglacial region of these mountains. Having these folk tales. As far as I know, the relatively temperate and even jungle climate areas not that far away don't have such folk tales. It's sort of similar to the idea of like the wild man of Borneo or something like that. You have a remote area, the tales dwindle out over time or get rationalized as the forest falls or as the mountain is explored and scaled. That's about all. Peace out.